Oh, hi everyone. This is Roger Yates making his second YouTubey thingy bob type thing, and so up to date. I'm even using a selfie stick, which apparently are becoming passe now. So that would just about sum me up, really. Kind of, getting in tune with something as it goes out of fashion. That's me. So just to remind you who I am, I'm been an ethical vegan since 1979. I've been involved with the movement on all kinds of levels. Used to be a committee member for the BOAV. I was a press officer for lots and lots of different groups, including the Hunt Saboteurs and the Animal Liberation Front Supporters Group. I even spent some time at Her Majesty's pleasure for 4 years. That was nice. So I was asked by Caroline Bailey of AR Zone to write something about the distinction between animal rights and animal welfare, and so I thought that's what this video could be. And it's just really kind of the basic thing. Now I'm a sociologist, and so I tend to focus on the fact that social movements are claims makers. So that means we're very involved with language. We're claims makers in civil society. That's how sociologists see social movements. And the classic example, I suppose, is the feminist movement, who saw a problem and then made claims about it, i.e. that the ideology of society is patriarchal, etc. What we do as vegan animal rights advocates is say that the ideology of society is speciesist, and there's something we should do about it. We should move to a non-speciesist world through veganism. Okay, so that's where we kind of basically coming from. And my comment, I made a comment, a written comment on a recent James Aspey video about the constant use in the movement of the word cruelty. And I was arguing that we should be talking about animal rights instead, and that inherently the word cruelty fixes, kind of embeds us really into the welfarist tradition. So that's what I want to kind of talk about. I also did it in the context of the fact that we do street stalls in Dublin every week, and we often get people coming up, and they also find themselves embedded in the welfarist ideology, where cruelty is the issue. So the basic distinction then between rights is a kind of very basic distinction between rights and welfare, is that rights is about animal use, and welfare is about the treatment of other animals whilst they're being used. So that's a kind of basic distinction. And typically then, the traditional welfare groups, like the RSPCA, ISPCA in Ireland, HSUS in North America, for example, would be talking about improving the treatment, making welfare reforms. Now, we as animal advocates, we want abolition, okay? And yet our language still gets bogged down in welfare claims about cruelty. And I think this is problematic. And so this is a kind of brief video trying to kind of explain that in a way. The animal rights case was made initially by an abolitionist called Tom Regan, who wrote The Case for Animal Rights in 1983. That book is quite difficult to read. It's not the best introduction to Reagan. If you want to go for Reagan, I always tend to recommend Defending Animal Rights from 2001. That's the book, and that's like a set of essays, which is quite useful. And also there is a really brilliant, almost like quintessential statement about animal rights from 1989 in a video which was recorded for a BBC series called Animal Night. It was an arena kind of special type thing, and that is very powerful. Reagan in that covers a lot of ground, even though it's only about 8 minutes long, covers a lot of ground, lays out the case for animal rights, rights-based case for animal rights. He talks in terms of rights violations, and he also critiques the dominant philosophy of the animal rights movement, which is utilitarianism. That's around about 7-8 minutes in, towards the end. And he also points out the fact, which is why we've got this little backdrop here, which is a quote from Reagan, which is that human rights and the theory of animal rights are interconnected. In fact, animal rights is based on some of the basic ideas of human rights thinking. In particular, what's called negative rights. And it's one of the things that I suggest that we need to learn, the difference between positive and negative rights. And also, we need to learn, if we want to make a rights-based case, the difference between legal rights and moral rights. Quite often, our claims making gets bogged down in legal rights, and we get involved with all kinds of parliamentary, legal kind of campaigns, whereas the case for animal rights is based on moral rights. Now, moral rights are kind of ideas. They don't exist in nature, okay? In the same way as the speed limit doesn't exist in nature. But the speed limit exists in society because it's socially constructed, which means that we argue about it, we adhere to it, and we've also got law enforcement officers who will enforce it. So the speed limit exists even though it doesn't really exist. Now, the case for animal rights is the same. It's an idea, okay? But human rights is an idea too. Human rights don't exist in nature, okay? But they exist to the extent that we think about them and we create them through thinking rationally and arguing about the scope and focus of human rights. And so that means then that women's rights, for example, existed before men in the British Parliament were kind enough to give them rights through legislation. This is a very impoverished way of thinking about rights, as though they're gifts. They're not. They exist before law, pre-legal rights. And that is one of the points that Reagan makes in the 1989 video, that rights exist even though they are routinely violated. So women's rights exist, but they're routinely violated. The case for animal rights says that other animals have rights, but they are routinely disrespected and violated. So this is the problem. Now, going back to our claims making is overwhelmingly welfarist. And the problem with making cruelty claims, I think that the basic difference is, you could think of claim number one, the cruelty claim, is don't be cruel to other animals. Now, we make that claim. The rights-based claim would be stronger in my view, which would say things like other animals are rights bearers or rights holders, and what we do to them as humans when we use other animals are rights violations. Okay. Now, there are lots and lots of objections to this kind of rights language that I'm using, not least from feminists and from anarchists, and also from within the kind of rank and file, if you like, of the animal rights movement. So it begs the question, why is it called the animal rights movement? And there's an irony here, because in my experience, people don't like to be called animal welfarists, even though they might use kind of the theoretical framework of animal welfare. So they use the word animal rights, or sometimes animal liberation, instead, because it sounds more radical, and they don't like to be associated with, the likes of the RSPCA, kind of dog and cat loving kind of people. Although I do notice that the idea of loving other animals as the basis of our concern is coming back into the movement, it was kind of rejected in the 1980s. We would talk about respecting other animals. It doesn't matter whether we love them or not, in the same way as it doesn't matter if we love, people in the developing countries. It means that we should respect their rights. It's a stronger position. So we kind of almost go for the weaker position all the time, which is by talking about cruelty. And as soon as we talk about cruelty, we're embedded into the welfarist ideology, which we're taught as children. We are taught essentially through welfare ideology that non-cruel use is not only feasible, it's common, and it's the norm. Okay, so when people come up to our stall, they're always searching for the non-cruel use, which they've in a way been promised. that they can kind of justify and we can kind of sanction. So, they often come up and they'll announce, oh, I'm a vegetarian, and what they want from that is they want us to praise that. I tend to make a joke of it. I say, well, there's a cure for that, and because it's interesting, because the history of the vegan movement is it's always been critical of vegetarianism. It shouldn't attack vegetarians, but it should be critical of vegetarianism. There's a kind of big difference there. But these people are almost like looking for validation. And we all know as animal advocates, especially the ones who do street work, is that people will go, oh, well, I don't eat much meat, as though their reduction of animal flesh is going to mean something to us, right? Because they're wanting our validation. Oh, I only eat red meat, they might say. I've been a vegetarian for so many years. I always make sure that my food is organic. I know a butcher who, treats the animals well, blah, blah, blah. And so immediately we're getting bogged down into welfarism. They're searching for a use of other animals which is non-cruel in their eyes. And they kind of think that's what we're after as well, because we keep talking about cruelty. It's as though, if we think about the issue of non-cruel use, the promise of animal welfarism, then it's as though they're focusing on the fact that there's cruelty involved. If they can get to the situation where they've got non-cruel use, then everybody should be happy. Okay, but that's not really our position. Okay, our position as animal rights advocates is that regardless of how humane something is, or how lacking in cruelty something is, then we still are opposed to it because we're opposed to animal use across the board. That's the meaning of vegan animal rights. Unfortunately, we don't reflect our core meaning in our language as we talk to people, and so I think that's why we confuse people quite a lot, because we don't make it clear that we're animal rights advocates who regard other animals as rights bearers, they're rights holders, and when we use them, that's a rights violation. Okay, people go, well, people are used to the language of welfare and cruelty. Well, yeah, that's the problem. They are, because it means that they're getting themselves embedded into that ideology again, that they're going, okay, well, we're searching for the non-cruel use. I think it's a big mistake to go for that. We are kind of setting ourselves up to getting bogged down in something somewhere we didn't want to go to in the first place. I much prefer to talk about justice and rights and to establish where we're at right at the beginning. Okay, and so when then they come out and go, well, we get a lot of questions about, which is worse, halal slaughter or conventional slaughter. We can cut right through that. We don't have to get bogged down in that and go, well, they're both rights violations. Oh, have you heard about those damn Chinese? They eat dogs. Well, we eat other animals too, and they're all rights violations. It kind of clarifies things for us in our minds really well. So it's always been surprising to me that there's so much resistance to animal rights within the animal rights movement. A lot of it has got to be placed at the level of the national groups, because they all promote a non-rights position, even though they might call themselves animal rights. And this has caused a lot of philosophical confusion in the movement. But the movement is a mess in a philosophical sense. The kind of philosophical kind of lead of this movement has always been Peter Singer. Peter Singer doesn't believe in rights. We're talking about moral rights. Okay. In fact, he used to argue bitterly that he was called by the animal rights movement a rights person. He used to argue bitterly about that, and he's kind of given up. He realizes that we're kind of not sophisticated enough to see the difference. He doesn't make a rights-based case. He doesn't think the moral foundation for a social movement on rights is a good idea. You know, he's a utilitarian. It's about consequences. And you'll see now with the growth of welfare, with the growth of with the growth of reducitarianism, that all these people are folding in to this idea that it's all about the reduction of suffering. It's all about what are the consequences. And they're almost like saying principles don't really matter. You know, so we're getting a lot of slide back now within the vegan movement. There's a lot of attacks on the vegan movement from various places. And part of it is the fact that we've never really developed a way of expressing ourselves as rights-based animal advocates. We use the label rights rhetorically. You know, most people who use the word animal rights don't actually mean it in any kind of deep philosophical way. It's just a label, in other words. You know, that's always been a problem. It's been a problem because there are some people, and I would classify myself as one of them, who wants to place rights-based thinking at the center of what we do, at the center of our claims making, at the center of our presentations. And we're hampered by the fact that most people think that something else is animal rights. And that something else are different versions of animal welfarism. So a kind of major kind of problem. But going back to this distinction, I would argue that we really need just to kind of like learn a few basics in order to improve our claims making, in my view. And those basics are the difference between moral and legal rights and the difference between positive and negative rights, because animal rights actually is a very modest idea. It's a modest idea with far-reaching ramifications. It's a kind of like a weird kind of thing in that sense, because we're not really asking for much in terms of rights. In terms of negative rights, we're asking for those rights that protect. Okay, we're not talking about other more expressive positive rights. We're not talking about the right to vote, the right to drive, the right to education, all those kind of human things. In some way, the way I kind of explain it, and hope you find this useful, is that I claim that our basic rights are our animal rights, that we as animals share with other animals, other sentient beings, some basic rights in terms of protection. Okay, so some philosophers talk about basic and non-basic rights, and essentially what they're saying is without our basic rights, our non-basic rights don't really make any sense. They're not much use. You know, if we don't have the right to live, or that right is violated and disrespected, then all other kind of human rights are kind of worthless. So I always argue that we have some basic rights and then some non-basic rights, or some negative rights and some positive rights. And we build our human rights on our basic animal rights. And so that's the way it works. You know, we can see that distinction, but we share basic rights with other animals. They don't just apply to us. Basic rights are only logical when we extend them over the species barrier. And that's the thing that Tom Reagan was credited with, by getting the idea of rights over the species barrier. You know, academics credit him for doing that, and that's exactly what he did. Unfortunately, the social movement that takes the name animal rights didn't really go with it. You know, there was a short period in the 1980s when people were listening to Reagan's position, and they were articulating themselves much more strongly in the rights-based way of doing it, you know. But then it slid back into welfare, and again, you know, welfare is kind of easier to sell, and so again we've got the national group spectre here. You know, what's not necessary is for the grassroots to fit in with that paradigm. You know, we because we're not based on money and wages and careers and everything, we can talk about what we want, and what we should talk about if we are animal rights advocates is we should talk about rights. Okay, my attitude really is, if you don't believe in rights, or you don't think rights is a good way of putting it, then call yourself something else, because there are some people who do want to base everything they do on rights. those people are being frustrated by the people who just take the name, who just use it rhetorically. The classic example here, and Anthony Nocello II talks about this, is that quite often in North America, when you mention that you're an animal rights advocate, especially if you're in another radical space with other social justice movement participants, they'll ask you if you're a member of PETA, because people think that PETA have got something to do with animal rights, which they don't. They reject animal rights. The problem is they also lie about it, in the sense that if you go even now to their North American site and you look up books, the only philosophical book they have is Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, but they classify it as an animal rights book, which is not true. They know it's not true. There is a kind of lie going on in the movement. It's very misleading, very confusing, and to people coming into the movement, you don't really get much chance. People even checking out the movement can be easily misled. I once gave a school talk about 2 years ago now. We gave a school talk on the outskirts of Dublin, and it was with some students who were doing their animal rights project, and we went there to help. And we said, okay, so how have you got so far? And they said, well, we've looked at animal rights, and we've found the World Wildlife Fund and PETA. So we had to spend the first 10 minutes of our hour with them, advising them on their animal rights project. We had to spend the first 10 minutes explaining that neither of those groups stood for animal rights. So there's lots of confusion. It would be really useful in order to advance the case for animal rights, and to also honour the legacy of Tom Reagan in particular, which is important for me as an individual, is if we learnt about animal rights proper. I think the internet age has got something to do with that. I gave a talk for VegFest, and I was asking people about which books they'd read. About 10 years ago, if you said this, what you would probably get is that most people had read Peter Singer. Few people would read Gary Francione, and even fewer people would be aware of the work of Joan Denea. On this occasion, which was about 18 months ago now, I suppose, even most people had never read Peter Singer, and the other two were, well, Francione was known as a name, but his work wasn't known, and Joan Denea wasn't known at all. So in some senses, this is kind of like the problem of the internet age, because the internet age is obviously incredibly good for putting out information, but it's not great for developing an in-depth, understanding of stuff. I think part of that is the fact that to talk about something as complicated as animal rights proper, you need a bit of time. And we know that, everybody now goes onto YouTube, and hardly anybody goes to the end of thing, I can guarantee that most people won't get to the end of this video, because most people don't get to the end of any video. It's kind of the way it works. And in fact, there are two bits of evidence that I have to kind of prove that in a way. It used to be the case in days gone by when you were uploading to YouTube, you could only do it in 10-minute sections. They wouldn't allow you to put, say, a 40-minute slot in, right, all at once. So you'd have part 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you look at that, part 1 might have 2,000 views. Part 2 then is going to have 1,000 views. Part 3 is going to have 500 views. And part 4 is probably going to have 320 or something. Because people don't watch things to the end. Another example, in 2013, I became frustrated and angered by a lot of the fact that some basic ideas about veganism were under attack. So I made a video which is called Attacking Vegans One Talk at a Time. And at the end of that, there's a brilliant piece where the person who attacks veganism is completely caught out by an animal rights point, because he's talking about Bill Clinton. And he says here in this article, Bill Clinton is described as a vegan. What's wrong with that? Somebody from the audience, an animal rights advocate, says, well, because he eats tuna. And the speaker goes, yeah, so he eats tuna from time to time. But can you see the benefit of that? And the audience member goes, what, to the tuna? And the speaker, who doesn't answer questions very well in the first place, just goes red with embarrassment because he's caught out by an animal rights point. Now, I made that video, which was about, I don't know, 60 minutes long, and I asked people about that end bit, about whether they'd kind of copped on to what was going on. And everybody who'd seen the video had not seen that bit. You know, I didn't meet anybody who'd seen it to the end. So I think that's a kind of problem in the sense that it does take a little bit of work. I think we're going to have to get back to reading a little bit, you know, and I think that for all the good of the internet age, we do have a problem, and I suffer from it as much as anybody else, is the fact that you're getting so much stuff. You tend just to skim a few things, you know, you move on, you know, or even you think, I'll come back to that, and you never do because it gets lost, you know. So there is a kind of problem there, you know, it's almost like information's coming in too quickly, you know, it's a kind of real kind of internet kind of problem. Anyway, before I sound too much like a boring old fart, let me just reiterate then that I'm claiming that if we believe in animal rights, we should talk about animal rights, and we should talk about it in a rights-based way, or in Reagan's way, we'd talk about the rights view, you know. And I think this is very important, you know, but mainly if we want to take an animal rights position, and I mean, going back to the James Aspey video, and I'm not attacking him at all because he's just embedded into a movement. He's brought up into a movement where you do this. You say, well, you know, I'm going to give you an animal rights talk, and then he talks about cruelty, you know. And once you talk about cruelty once again, you immediately get embedded into welfare problems, because the ideology teaches people that non-cruel use is possible, you know, non-cruel use is feasible, and so that's what they're looking for, you know. When we talk to them about cruelty, they're looking for the non-cruel. Well, tell me what's not cruel. That's essentially what they do. They come up and they go, you know, tell me what's not cruel, you know, and we respond by saying, well, everything involves rights violations. But that's not the way that we normally talk. You know, if we engage with them about cruelty, then we're just making the job harder, in my view. Okay, that's my second video. I'll put some, what did they say? I'll put some links down below of the things that I talked about, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.